We're live. Good morning, beautiful people of the internet. Alas, we have no Jay today, so I'm doing the intro again, Jay Stiley. But we are joined by the very youthful-looking Adam Lawrence today. Don't know what he's done differently. And Piotr back.
Yes,
Yay!
finally.
Yes. How are we, chaps? How are we this bright and sunny Sunday morning? Well, it's sunny here.
Well, I'm pleased to report if I put any filters on, it's a pure fluke because my tech ability doesn't allow for things like filtering stuff. It's just not a possibility, not within the realms of possibility. So must just be that skincare regime I've been following religiously or something like that. I don't know.
And Piotr looks like a little ray of sunshine. Look, he's glowing.
It looks like he's benefited from the time off. That's for sure. That is for sure.
It's I think a week in a festival, sleeping in tents. It makes people younger. It makes you appreciate the and the home and everything else that we have on a daily basis.
That's a fair point. Gratitude is always good.
Yes. Yes, but we're back. I missed this. Yeah, I was wondering how Jay is gonna perform with all the tech stuff, but I can see I trained him well, and he really excelled. Yeah.
He did amazingly. We had comments, we had questions. Oh yeah, all over it.
Amazing, really good. Now I know I can take time off. It really put my mind at ease. Nice. But yeah, I was thinking like we've been doing this show now for 2 years, and maybe we took like 4 or 5 Sundays off, including like holidays and Christmas and Easter. So it's a big thing. Soon we're gonna be having like second birthday from the reactivation. But yeah, anyway, let's start with Adam's Cliff Notes.
Sure. So we had a bit of a quieter week this week, really, in terms of it did look a bit like things had geared down a bit for the summer holidays, which I'm sure is no accident in general. But the overall sort of economic performance news was all pretty glum for the economy, which is in theory rosier for the interest rate landscape, although we're unlikely to see the benefit of that in particularly near term. So it's worth this week putting in context that both the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve raised their rates again, even though the Federal Reserve certainly looks like it's got inflation fairly significantly under control, or certainly going in the right direction. So they're clearly not stopping until they've really cooled the economy down. It's a bit of an interesting one, but I think they've probably got the most credibility they've had for something knocking 20 years, to be honest with you, because they've really got the market where they want it to be, understanding, anticipating. And I'm suggesting that even though in their cliff notes after their speech this week, they suggested it could go up again, this, that, the other, I think they're bluffing this time. But I think this time the market has lost its appetite to call them too quickly on those bluffs, really, because they've got credibility. They've done what they said they were going to do, and they're still going upwards despite looking like they've got the whip hand on the inflation piece at the moment. So you could ask yourself, why are they still going upwards? And that would be a legit question. But perhaps that move up gives a bit of room for maybe 2 or 3 pauses before people stop believing they're not going to put it up anymore, and then maybe just a slight bit of easing as we come into what will be the new year in 2024, something like that. Maybe they'd like to start the year on a drop note. I don't think they're going any higher, but they're so much further ahead of us in the cycle, and they're still raising rates. Has to have us relatively concerned that we're still going higher and higher. So the idea of the bank not putting rates up 0.25% next week is unlikely, to be honest. Although I do think it maybe sets us up for a September pause, which probably leads to another November hike, and we end the year at about 5.5%. That's my rough feeling on the base rate landscape, which will probably see us bounds the 5-year. And this is a brave prediction for a market that's swung 200 basis points high to low this year, but that probably sees the 5-year gilt, which is the one we're most interested in, finishing between about 4 and 4.5, which is a little bit easier than it was today. And they tried to test some lows in the bond market this week on Monday and got a very firm answer, and yields increased again towards the end of the week. So we're still looking at an average of about 6.75% a year total cost of debt. So that would include arrangement fees at the minute. All the manufacturing news was negative. All the purchasing managers index on the services side, which is obviously much bigger in the UK, also was below consensus, which puts us at 50.7 on the composite, where 50 is the midline and under 50 would be deemed to be shrinking. So we're very close to the precipice here. There's half a chance we'll have a negative Q2, or we had a negative Q2 for GDP. It'll be really close. That extra coronation bank holiday might have made a difference, stupid as it sounds. And it looks quite likely at the moment that Q3 will be a negative quarter as well. So I'm not going to get too bogged down in that, because when you're talking about plus 0.1 and minus 0.1, you're only really talking technical recessions that don't do too much apart from a bit of psychology. It's just quite interesting, as I've been saying for a long time now, how close to the zero that we are. And that's the bigger problem. Whether we're above it or below it is kind of moot, really, to be honest. It's the fact we're at zero and we're struggling to break away from that zero. So CPI on the back of that looks guaranteed to come back down quite a bit and get under Rishi's pledge number, which I suppose he'll be pleased about. But he won't be pleased when he realises that the cost of that is going into an election with a very stagnant economy. It's going to be difficult for them to kick it up the backside before what will probably then look like, September 24 is probably the last credible month they can call an election. Otherwise, it's fingernails on the cliff top from there on. So we're only just over a year away from that. And I also talked this week about energy performance, or energy inefficiency, as I call it, because that really is what summarizes the whole system that we have at the moment. You know, it's taken the minimum energy efficiency standards, the MEES as they're called, right? They were introduced into law in 2015, and it's taken 8 years for the government to admit that the scoring system isn't fit for purpose. 80 years. Now, you know, I looked and thought, were they introduced in like 2019? In which case you can kind of blame the pandemic a little bit. No. 2015 they were introduced. So you've got to blame Brexit and the pandemic for not doing any work in any other department, and it's not really credible, is it, to be honest? So they've admitted the system isn't fit for purpose. Scotland have had a complete disagreement with that and decided to draft something out there that suggests that you won't be able to sell your house in Scotland if it's below an EPC of C by 2025. Now, this is pretty typical politicking in that they've sort of floated it out there. They've been utterly murdered by the Daily Mail, GB News, who are suggesting it's a communist play or whatever. You know, the more extreme right you are, the more extreme the play is. It doesn't make any sense, and the maths doesn't add up. They've admitted they've got a figure of 33 billion to get all these homes up to standard, and they've pledged 1.8 billion, which is 5.5% of the required total. And that's to the end of this parliament, which looks nearly like 2025. I mean, you couldn't make it up. It's just such a joke. Although they've got a green zero carbon minister, or he sounds like the most green minister of all time. And he says the latest year they'll accept this to be through is 2033, which I've interpreted as the absolute earliest this could potentially possibly be done would be 2033. But still, finding that 33 billion over 10 years when they haven't got it in the first place, and when the rules, when the government starts funding something, the price goes up 150%. Inflation will have to kick in by the time they get their backsides into gear. Scotland, for once, and to be fair to Scotland, they are normally ahead of the game in terms of legislation, although with the rent controls they also proved they can veer completely off track sometimes. But they've been pretty good on ending Section 21, Section 33 as it was in Scotland. That's been over since 2017, model tenancy agreements, which are, I don't think particularly problematic. I think they're reasonable. I mean, you could say they're helping to protect the uninitiated, although the uninitiated don't read their tenancy agreements anyway, nor do they really worry about their legal obligations because they're well protected by the courts and shelter and the CAB and all the rest of it. But generally speaking, Scotland are seen as quite progressive. and they're behind on the energy efficiency stuff. So they've sort of tried to get back in front by making this huge play, which, as I say, doesn't add up and doesn't make a lot of sense. So on one side of the border, we're looking to revive the scoring system, and on the other side, they're looking to implement it devil may care at the cost of tens of billions of pounds. Not going to work out very well, is it really? And then, so I think
in Scotland, like Scotland's got such homes built out of granite, and there's so many obviously it's a massive kind of area for I don't know how many, 4 or 5 million people that lives in Scotland.
That's right.
And so many detached houses, so many like agricultural kind of land, and like no one's ever cared that much about energy efficiency there, because I don't know, they just like have fires and like wood fires and stuff, and that's how they heat their properties. And also they're quite well prepared for like living in cold conditions. They have jumpers, and they have basically protect themselves. They have their own personal energy efficiency. And I don't think Scotland is really needs that energy efficiency law as much as some other countries.
Well, I think you raised
sheds and open windows. And
you raised some really good points, Piotr, because apart from anything else, the trouble, I mean, certain parts of England, solar power, while it's not like it is in California, is pretty good. Solar power up in the north of Scotland, you can pretty much forget about it. It's not really worth even talking about. They're pushing heat pumps quite aggressively for reasons you can understand. Although also bear in mind that heat pumps below -5 degrees become very inefficient. So the very time you're likely to need them, in most of England, below -5 is not really too much of a concern. In a lot of Scotland, below -5 is almost guaranteed every winter, right? If not guaranteed. So the technology again doesn't match up. As I say, the solar thing doesn't work. Probably you mentioned an important thing.
The wind is as big in Scotland.
And wind is really interesting because there's this nuance in planning where basically if anybody objects to a wind turbine, then the wind turbine won't get built. And people seem to have this terrible idea in their head that they're so unsightly and all the rest of it. And I just think people just need to get over that, quite frankly, because that's why offshore wind is being pushed quite so much. But of course, Scotland has got a lot of coastline, and the offshore wind side of things might make sense. A couple of other things as well. I'd encourage anyone who goes out to somewhere like Dubai to look at how they tackle their energy efficiency problems. They just don't bother because fuel is cheap, and so lights just get left on all the time. It makes me laugh compared to how we live in the UK, where we leave the room and we turn the lights out and we do all that sort of stuff. It's just not even a concern. A lot of talking to people out there who have businesses, it's not even metered. It's not even metered. I mean, you're such a pebble in a pond, unfortunately. I'm not saying that means don't try, but it does mean put these things into context when we're going a little bit over the top about them without any real payback, without any real funding of them. There needs to be a pretty severe economic discussion before cracking on with all of that realistically. And it's not one that it's not one that Just Stop Oil are going to like very much, but we've got to live in the real world, not, friend of mine commented on Facebook the other week. He said, I wish my daddy was rich enough for me to join Just Stop Oil. And I just thought, doesn't that tells you what you need to know, doesn't it? Realistically. So bloody true. And the other thing is, like you mentioned, the heat loss perimeters of the houses, when you've got far fewer terraces, there's either cottage flats are quite common, which are quite useful for sharing heat loss boundaries. But then when you get out into the weeds a little bit, you've just got big detached. And also they're better at space heating, which they do with wood, which is not great for the environment in terms of burning it, sure. But the whole landscape and ecosystem is built around that. There's a lot of trees. There's a lot of wood to cut down. There's a lot of wood to burn. Space heating can be quite efficient, but heat pumps are almost certainly not the answer. Almost certainly not the answer to what's going on. So we do this thing where we kind of take what we've got available and try and shoehorn it to fit in. And as you say, Scotland and England, really, really different landscapes. Difference between heating a property in Bournemouth and heating a property in Thirsk or Thurso or something like that are just unbelievable. It's not like the same country.
Yeah, it's a difficult conversation because every country is got specific things, right? And like you say, you mentioned Dubai and the countries in the Middle East, they use a lot of energy, but the energy, like the oil there is so cheap, it almost doesn't matter. Like it's not an economic kind of concern. While here, there's way more taxes, way more kind of expense to heat things up. So
difference between importing it and not importing it as well, my friend. Let's face it, that's the truth. So
yeah, that's true.
How did you keep warm when you lived in Aberdeen?
I played a lot of football, and I actually lived in a property. It must have been on EPC F minus or something like that. It was a top floor flat, 1-bedroom flat, and I remember it had. I don't think it had any sort of roof insulation, almost definitely not, and had storage heaters. And basically, those storage heaters, they would heat up overnight, and then in the morning I'll be sweating like a pig, and then in the evening I'll be like, okay, I'll go to bed now. It's like basically a lot of jumpers and a lot of like mostly like personally managing my own kind of thing, and also I didn't used to spend much time at home, so like I would work nights and I would play football and I would like go to uni, and I would just keep way more active than in a cold flat, basically.
Those storage heaters are funny, aren't they? When I bought my flat in London, and bear in mind, this is like a 450 square foot flat. It's small, right? It's one bed. But it had actually been built in the 80s, but still it had these storage heaters. So when I gutted it, Carolina obviously like did the whole job. We literally took it back to brick and rebuilt it again from the inside. And I'm taking out these storage heaters. I can't tell you the amount of added space it gave. These things were enormous. Like, I don't know how big that is, but like the amount of actual space, like wall space, but actually encroaching onto the room. We're in 450 square foot. It matters.
When they're on, like there's literally like a 2-meter barrier that you should walk through.
well, have you tried to pick up one of these well, you couldn't. I mean, these new high heat retention ones, they weigh like 160 kilos. I mean, they're like a four-man lift and install. And they're ridiculous. I mean, that is some serious weight.
Wow.
And that goes on a wall.
Yeah.
God, not on any of my walls. It wouldn't. Wow.
Indeed.
As a fun fact from Mac, this July there's been hardly any temperature difference between London and Scotland. Well, summers can be good in Scotland. And
come back in December, Mac, and let us know how we're getting on. That's what I say.
Yeah.
That's what I say.
Yeah, this is a freak of the year. Oops. Okay, brilliant. Okay, there's another fun fact. In Kent, East Anglia and London can be colder than Scotland in winter when beast from the east comes to another freak.
I think I noticed when I was up in North Yorkshire earlier this week, and there was a 5-degree difference between North Yorkshire and Solihull as you drove up the road. You could see that difference. And quite often when I'm up in Lancashire or somewhere like that, I see it as I drive north. I see what goes on. So whereas I sometimes get on the train, go south, get into London, I'm like, it's 3 or 4 degrees hotter here than it is at home, quite noticeably, quite regularly.
It is really noticeable. When I go up to see like my family, my parents, honestly, I get out and I'm like, and this is why I don't live here. Yeah.
When I moved from Aberdeen to London, I literally felt like London is a tropical place. Like it was so noticeable, and like you didn't have to wear like big coats and stuff. Like, it was great.
Thermal vest.
Yeah.
Well, we were reminiscing earlier this week because last year when the 40-degree temperature was actually hit in Market Raisin in Links, where we're doing a development at the moment, and we were in Mallorca at the time, which was lovely, and was also only 32 degrees. So we were out the UK for the hottest week we'd ever had, or whatever. And of course, it's a funny thing, isn't it? Because there's been these enormous temperatures in not only in we've heard about it mostly in Southern Europe, but also in China and parts of Asia. And, it's been pretty rubbish in the UK for most of the last couple of weeks, really, with the occasional bit of sunshine. So it is amazing quite how much climate can vary in the short term.
But I really think like those EPC and kind of energy standards and all these other things, like it's made like in countries like UK or I don't know, like Western countries, it's more made for as an example to other countries rather than anything that's got significant impact on actual performance and actual use of energy. But it's like really just made for an example for other countries to follow, because I don't see any other reason for disadvantaging people.
No, I don't think anyone apart from a fairly extremist would deny that that's the right thing for the UK to do. But there's a few things to qualify that. Number one, it needs to be the right technology, right? It doesn't just need to be what's there and just thrown out at all costs to, instead of investing in healthcare or education or whatever else would be deemed to be extremely important, just throwing money at it for virtue signaling purposes, which is effectively what it is. Number two, the big countries in the world need to be on board, rightly or wrongly. I was looking at some stuff about the 90s for some pieces that I've written over the last few weeks. And, we were the third biggest economy in the world, right? We're now sixth, right? So we've slipped 3 places in 30 years, right? Now that's the nature of the beast. We were the world's reserve currency. We're only a certain size. We only have a certain number of natural resources. We're disadvantaged by demographics to some extent in terms of GDP. So that's going to be the nature of the beast. But that means we've got to work harder to get the people at our level and above us on, we won't be going 5th next, we'll be going 7th, So we need to get those people on board. It's not our job to police the world at all costs, right? It's our job to allocate our own resources really, really well. And the resources that need to be allocated in this are in research and development at the moment. They're not in deploying technology like heat pumps in Scotland, which are not fit for purpose, right? We need to do better. We need better geothermal. Geothermal is a fantastic technology that needs to be rolled out. That's moved on a lot. Instead of, you used to need about half an acre to have a proper ground source heat pump because it went in a sort of wiggly track or whatever. Now you can have boreholes, right? We've moved forward in that. Now we need to work on making those boreholes more affordable, because geothermal is unlimited energy with no output and done. And nuclear, I've spoken about before at significant length. These are the techs we need to be investing in. But no, people are too worried about nuclear for reasons that are absolutely, completely incorrect. They're worried about it in theory, and politically you struggle with nuclear because people are idiots. So we do need to try and get these things. I think we should be leading the way in getting it right rather than leading the way in virtue signalling, which ultimately that's what Just Stop Oil is, a virtue signalling organisation. It's just a bag of nonsense without any answers to the problems.
I think the real solution to all this climate things is if all the Western countries and US, UK, France, Germany would go and say, China, let's be friends, let's not fight. You kind of produce a lot of this gases and stuff, and you're obviously doing this for economic purposes. How about we do make some arrangements that we give you some money or we give you some things, and then we give you like an advantage, so you don't have to do all these things to get rich, and we all get rich and we all get like to live in this kind of environment, right? Because otherwise, like all this fighting and all this, like I don't know, if you apply the game theory to all this, like how the climate, like gases are produced, why they're produced and stuff like that, you would come to like conclusion that it's because of the competition between the countries, between like people wanting to get rich at any cost, almost given the technology that's available right now, right? Countries like India, they're so underdeveloped. They're thinking of what's coming in next week or a few days, like how they're gonna feed their families and stuff, right? They don't have the same amount of thought that
is true. But if you look at the nuclear plants in development in the world at the moment, right? Number one by a mile, China. Right, and India are right up there in terms of wanting to lose nuclear power as well. They can see and they know it's the future. What have China actually done? They've tried to dominate the supplies of uranium, by developing the Silk Road, so they can get all the materials out of Africa, who are still too early on, generally speaking, to build the nuclear plants of their own, right? So they can, in a way that, you know, the British were the last ones to really try and take over the whole of the world with the empire by military force. The Americans have done it much more by economic force and giving people friendly loans and things like that, and tried a sort of economic domination of the world. The Chinese are now trying a resource-led domination of the world. And that's not going to work either, because their domestic engine is now stalled significantly. And actually someone like India, who a lot of the rest of the world are much more comfortable trading with than China, are in a massive ascendancy phase right now and are providing the demographics in terms of just the age of the growing population that will lead them to be a really, really significant force. But they're not really putting us to shame. We're not really putting them to shame in terms of how green our development of technology is. And then you run up against that problem that we've talked about before, where even with incredible proliferation of both wind and solar, you won't be able to power 1/3 of the world by 2050 with wind and solar alone, right? Even with incredible assumptions in the growth rates of both of those technologies. So if you don't have the geothermal and you don't have the nuclear, you're screwed. Or you're not. You're still stuck with oil and coal and natural gas. That's where you'll be. And that's just the numbers, unfortunately, not the... But that's why the EPC, in short, that's why the EPC needs reforming, right? Apart from anything else, the scoring is. I mean, at the moment, have you seen the idea? The other thing that came out this week was they were going to give up on boilers by 2035, and now they've given up on that. And they've given up on the idea of 2035 being the date. My first memory is of it being 2016 by the time there would be no more gas boilers in new builds. So that shows you how that target's doing. You know, it's just they just realise it's unworkable because they haven't got the tech to be able to phase them out. It can't be done. And not everyone, unfortunately, can wear jumpers and play football. And it's all very well for a live young 19-year-old Piotr Rusinek to do that. But unfortunately, if you're sitting in your home and you're, you've got a carer or you're of a certain age.
I ended my football career at age 25. So, yeah. I do welcome the EPC changes. Although I have moved to Lisbon, which is like a much nicer place for this stuff.
We're all jealous. Don't worry. We're all jealous.
Brilliant. Well, I mean, it's like in terms of like when we look at some properties like in the auctions nowadays, I don't think that many people are still looking at EPC ratings. We do highlight it to clients, for example, when they haven't had an EPC. We've got a couple of properties now where the EPC hasn't been done for like I think 7 or 8 years, and in the meantime people had gas boilers installed, windows changed and things like that, and the EPC on one of the properties was like E. And when the client told me that all these changes were done, I'm like, okay, well, if they were done, just do a new EPC, because it probably won't add to the price you get for the property, but it won't put off people bidding, and it will make a smoother thing. So I would always encourage people to like do a revised EPC if your EPC isn't up to like a C star or close to C, and you made some improvements.
I think that raises a really interesting point that I wanted to develop a bit more in the supplement this week, but I just ran out of time ultimately. And this is a bit of a classic when you do surveys of people, right? And this has been going on for years, since George Osborne changed the rules around Clause 24 of the Finance Act in 2015 in the notorious budget, right? Everybody said early on, I'm going to sell, sell. And I was one of the first people to call people out saying, no, you're not. You're not. You're just saying that because you think by saying it, you'll be able to change their mind. And you're not going to change their mind, right? And sure enough, there hasn't been this gigantic sell-off. Now, introduce vastly quickly increasing interest rates, and you actually see people starting to sell. Although you still see fewer people selling than have said they're going to sell, right? So what they've done on the energy efficiency front is they've said, now, of course, when you consider homes, even though the pressure is really being applied to the private rental sector first of all, when they're canvassing all of this stuff, they're talking about the whole of the market. So in surveys, on average, the average homeowner is willing to pay £33,000 more for a house with better energy efficiency measures. So they said, right? Now, there's two things that I think probably come to mind there. One, people who are more likely to live in Liberal Democrat voting areas, let's say, which tend to be high GDP per capita, high household income, right? They're much more likely to want to pay for that stuff because apart from anything else, it'll assuage some of their middle class guilt for the amount of energy and carbon that they use, especially when they go on the fantastic holidays they go on every year, right? So that's one point of view. The second point of view would be that apart from anything else, when you think about buying a house, you also think about borrowing the money to do it. Generally speaking, when you're moving up the chain, you're not using your own cash. So there's a big difference between paying 33k extra for a house when you might be able to borrow 75, 80, 90, 95% of that, right? And spending 33k from your bank account in transforming your current property and retrofitting it. Now, of course, some stuff, as Piotr said earlier on about Scotland, some stuff doesn't really suit retrofitting anyway, and it's just not. If you live in a grade 2 listed anything, forget about it, right? It's going to be really, really nearly impossible because the conservation officers are going to stop you. They're just going to stop you doing what you would want and need to do. And you're just not going to be able to do it unless you do it illegally. So that's a very typical, here's my intention versus here's how I actually behave. So as Piotr said, I'm still not seeing, flat with an EPC of B across the road, flat with an EPC of E, should be a significant difference between the two, right? But it doesn't necessarily manifest itself like that. So this is still being undervalued by the market, which is great news, because if you're trying to buy stock, you can still pick up stuff that's got an EPC of B or C, for the same money as D's and E's. And there are also those nuances. You go and do the work, do the auction viewing, note down loosely what you think. Take the EPC with you, note down the reality versus the assumptions. You might be able to buy Piotr's giving his clients some good advice there, but of course, not everybody is going in with the same level of detail or information. So there might be E's that you pick up that are automatically C's, which is worth. I said today they've said the average property would be 7,500 to get up to C, but I think the maths is flawed because about 40% of them are already up to C. So
I also encourage people to see when the EPC was done, because it's C and it was done in 2015. Like a new EPC is due in the next a year, 2 years, because it only lasts for 10 years. And the rules that were there in 2015 for EPC calculations are so different to right now. So your EPC might come out as E, even though you had C in 2015. So I think it's important to put some thought into when the EPC was done, what the and what the features of the flat or the house that you're buying, because this will impact on how EPC is created.
Completely agree as well. It's a double-edged sword, isn't it? It's a double-edged sword.
It is that 10-year period, and I so don't understand it. I mean, it's good in a sense, but at the same time, it is a double-edged sword.
Yeah, I think it's the value of the domestic energy assessor qualification has been so devalued, and actually, one way or another, is going to end up being so important when they do finally decide on. I mean, my interpretation of the rhetoric this week, because even Rishi mentioned it this week, right, is that this is too complex for us to do anything out before the next election. But I think interestingly, the Tories are making a bit of a mistake because Labour have started dropping all these pledges they've been making, right, in terms of how they're going to fund this and fund that, and are saying, no, we need to focus on growth, right, which doesn't sound very green, right? Remember, the Green Party doesn't want growth. It thinks pursuing growth is pursuing the wrong objective, right? And so what the Tories are doing is falling into a trap, which is the same trap that Labour fell into last time, of making sure they must be to the right of the Labour Party on their views. So if the Labour Party are not so green, but want to make sure there's prosperity for all and try and eradicate poverty, then the Conservatives start dropping green pledges left, right and centre So, and that's not a very good idea, because 57% of the population, as surveyed by YouGov, are behind green measures. Now, a lot of those people will be relatively misguided, as we've talked about earlier on, in terms of the economic reality of those green measures. But winning elections is not about economic reality, right? It's about perception. And that's why Brexit happened, and that's why, you know, all of these things are pretty. So I think they're allowing themselves slightly to be boxed off slightly into a bit of a corner. Although it did make me laugh. Did you see that 25-year-old that got elected in Selby? His name is Kia, and he actually looks a little bit like Starmer as well. It's like there's some quite good banter available from on the back of all of that. But it's interesting that what the Tories did do is they still managed to win the by-election in Uxbridge, because they basically used ULEZ as the issue, and that's where Labour have made a mistake, because, you know, you can't annoy people any more than messing with cars, parking and roads, right? It just annoys the hell out of people, and they need to sort themselves out. But I think Sadiq Khan's on a mission on his own, and Starmer's got to deal with that, rather than looking like a bit of a lemon, really, to be honest.
Interesting. But yeah, what do you think would happen, like if the election were next week and Labour got created? What would be like the next week, 2 weeks after the election?
Good question. I mean, they're going to have to, let's presume a couple of things, right? They're going to have to set out a pretty tightly costed manifesto, because the number one trope that the Tories will use against them, what's this election about, right? It's about pockets. It's about the economy. That's the I'm not saying it's a single issue, but it's the big one.
Yeah.
People are feeling the pinch. So Labour are going to have their fairly tightly costed manifesto to keep up with. I think they did announce fairly quickly that there's going to be some tax increases, not necessarily in the first couple of weeks, but, you know, their first budget, they're going to announce some tax increases that they've promised, probably targeting the non-DOMs. Whether that'll be successful or not, who knows? But again, it's a bit of an ideological thing rather than a truly workable policy that will raise any real money. I think they're trying to sidestep when they're asked the question about capital gains tax, and are saying, like, it's not part of our plans. It's not part of our plans. But I think it's part of their plans pretty bloody quickly, if I'm honest with you. It just seems a no-brainer for them to target that sort of stuff. I think they will look towards what I did mention in the supplement today, that it's not necessarily all bad, because they'll be quite keen on, at the moment, who's getting hit the hardest if you read the press, who gets hit the hardest by the interest rate rise, right? The mortgage holders, yeah? But that manifests itself in articles about homeowners, and wow, you know, my mortgage has gone up 500 quid a month or whatever, right? In reality, as a percentage of their disposable income, compare that to when you rent a property and your landlord's mortgage has gone up by 500 quid a month, right? And the amount of extra disposable income you've got to find, especially if you've been in a property for a number of years where a landlord hasn't raised the rent, right? You've either got to go to market, which is absolutely rocketing, or find an extra 300, 400, 500 quid a month, which you can't find because you don't have it in your disposable income. Yeah. So that's a very, you know, centre right to right wing view of what's going on has been put forward by the press in general, right? I think Labour are going to be much keener to do something about that than the Tories are, or have been, right? So I'd expect some form of level of support or something. I don't know what. I don't know how you'd manifest it, because I don't think rent controls. I think they've ruled out rent controls, and they know that they're stupid. I don't know how they could directly or indirectly subsidise, but I guess they could look at doing something in the same way that Sunak did when he was Chancellor, around like the hardship funds for local authorities and stuff like that. They've generally been quite good value for what they do. You know, you're not talking about 10 billion, you know, you're talking about a couple of billion, which would also lower costs, because you don't want people moving around who get, you know, when you ask tenants who are already under pressure, some of them just think they're going to get council housing, and they're not really that well educated in how easy or hard it isn't to get a council house. You know, reasonably hard, although not as hard as as some people make out. About 56% of people who are on the waiting list for a council house in a year get housed within a year, right? So yeah, more than you would think, right?
Yeah.
But that's only 56%, and also it's within 1 year. If you've got to go into temporary for 8 months with children, while you wait for that, you're still in that 56%, but you haven't had a very good year, right? So that also needs bearing in mind. But yeah, I think they'd be a lot more proactive on the what can they do for the renters kind of front, and inevitably that actually would help the landlord a bit. I don't see them repealing the landlord tax side of things, because politically I think that's unpalatable for them to do that, even though it wouldn't be the worst idea in the world. But I do see them trying to do something slightly differently and worrying less about the home owning class and more about the renter class, because that is their idea. You've got to bear in mind, who are the big players if Labour got in tomorrow or next week or whatever, like you said, Piotr? Obviously Starmer, Rayner, Rachel Reeves, Lisa Nandy, Wes Streeting. I guess that's the sort of top five. Well, Rayner and Nandy are both pretty bloody left wing, right? Really, really quite left wing. So I would expect to see them have some kind of influence, because I don't know what the plan is. But if they would be able to put together 2 terms, let's say, I'm sure within that second term, Rayner would be discussing what it takes for her to be leader of the party. Because at the moment, apart from Streeting, she's absolutely in the box seat, and she's very popular with traditional Labour voters. There is an interesting nuance, though, that I thought I should mention, because I think Alistair Campbell brought this up on the Rest is Politics podcast. He was talking about being in a taxi and the driver was British Indian. And he was talking about the way that Rishi is getting attacked in general for some of his policies, and said, because the British Indian community has traditionally been quite heavy Labour voters, right? Although they are very much in favour of that singular conservative principle of, work hard, look after yourself, and the rest will follow. So it's an interesting dichotomy. They're really, to generalise, I think, on the Labour side of things, because they're generous people. They want to help to look after people. They see that as being, but they see you as the person.
Community thing, isn't it? Yeah. It's but then from like the actual wealth perspective, the more like conservatives, because
absolutely,
they buy their own property, they work hard, they want to see the benefits of the work, and they know that it coming, but also they have this kind of mindset of like family is important, community is important, and I think that's more of a Labour thing. So yeah,
exactly. So that tells you they're closer to the middle than Labour might like. They're not a guaranteed vote by any stretch of the imagination. So Rishi actually strikes a lot of the right notes, and also provides he's the ultimate. Parents worked incredibly hard to send him. He's a very, 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 very Indian subcontinent mentality, right? Very, very. So there's quite a few interesting things to play out just yet that need some consideration. But Sunak is being made to look weak, or making himself look weak on some, and plus his 5 pledges. This one about we will stop the small boat crossings. What a stupid thing to make one of your 5 pledges. Because I just don't, politically, I don't understand why you bother to try and placate the Braverman, Rees-Mogg, ERG side of the party. They're voting Conservative anyway. They might not like it, but they're voting Conservative. Get in the middle, sort out the bigger problems. Those 5 pledges should have been all about healthcare and the economy, and that's it. Right? Immigration shouldn't have featured. If you look at YouGov, do a great weekly poll that takes the temperature of what the important issues in the economy are, and if you in the country are according to what people are going to vote on the basis of, right? So if you look at those polls before the 2015 election, immigration was miles and miles ahead of anything else as an issue, and that's why the Conservatives were smart in a way. They put the referendum in the manifesto, saying they'd sort it out. They were stupid for calling it early. Right, and they didn't put the amount of necessary work in that would have needed to, and they didn't get the right influential people, aka Boris, on board before they cracked on with calling the referendum. Yeah. If you look today, despite the net migration numbers being a hell of a lot higher than they were back then, and despite it being less organisation in terms of things coming from the EU, and a higher cost, right, to the exchequer of migrants that come in from outside of the EU, immigration is like 5th or 6th biggest issue in people's minds. Yeah, economy's number 1, healthcare's number 2 because of the waiting list. You know, these are the classics that you need to take the temperature on. And if immigration is 5th or 6th, you don't make it one of your 5 pledges just to placate, you know, 30% or 20% of the lunatics in your party just because they shout quite loud. You know, sod them, forget about it. They're nothing to do with what you need to do. But then that's why I should never have had Braverman as Home Secretary. It's a terrible mistake in the first place. You know, terrible mistake. But and it will upset people, and it will lead to things like it was Somerton and Frome, wasn't it, which went Lib Dem in the recent by-elections with a massive swing. Now, a lot of Lib Dem voters haven't forgiven the Lib Dems for what they did in 2010 after the coalition, right? But it's getting maybe far enough away for them to be the lesser of some evils. And if they pick up, say, 20, 30 seats, which is possible, that's lost it for the Tories straight away. Labour have written off Scotland, although if the SNP have been weaker in the last few years, I'm not sure I remember it. So maybe Labour can grab a few back in Scotland. And that hands Labour a, you know, 30, 40 seat majority. Also interesting was the tactical voting was about as good as it's ever been in those by-elections in terms of where you look, where people had voted versus where the intentions might have been. So I guess as time moves on, technology moves on, and there'll be tactical voting apps that tell people what to do.
Good comment from Helen, if I'm saying this correctly, from LinkedIn, probably from Adam. So Helen's LinkedIn. So regrettably, it's a harsh reality that political parties often make grand promises during campaigns only to abandon them once they secure victory. This behavior is truly disgraceful and disheartening.
I think they're probably saying the Labour Party's defence. They do seem to be doing the opposite of that at the moment, because they're dropping all they made these grand promises before it got started to look serious, and then they've dropped them right at the moment. So they might be in the seat of, you know, they know that it's theirs to lose at the moment. So they're trying not to offend too many people and rock too many boats. But I must say, although I'm not overly keen on her, she's a hell of a lot better than John McDonnell. And Rachel Reeves does speak with significant authority and sounds like someone who will really work very hard to control the purse strings. And if that addresses the number 1 trope about the Labour Party, that they spend too much money, and the number 1 issue in voters' minds, aka the economy, that sounds like a pretty good strategy at the moment. So, you know, Conservatives look like a more fractured party, even though in reality, a lot of people who were there under Corbyn and Starmer are poles apart, really. You know, Starmer is so much more of a Miliband/Blair kind of character in terms of the centrality of him. But let's see my fears are really around not them getting in, but what plays out when Starmer moves on. That's more of a problem.
Yeah, it's interesting, like how the political parties and politicians are very much incentivized to basically do things that are good for the next election rather than what's good for economy and what's good for the thing. Yeah. A friend of mine just said with me a week ago how some of the key decision makers or like material decision makers in banks are being remunerated and how their bonuses are being paid. Like a big percentage of the bonus, like 50%, is being paid in the shares of their company that are vested over the next 4 years. So basically, you're not incentivized to make stupid things quickly just to get quick bonus. You get shares in the company that you need to then wait 4 years to actually get money on them. So you're incentivized to make sure that the company keeps growing. And also, but I'm just wondering, like, how it would be possible to do something like that in politics, because politicians are not really incentivized by their personal kind of money. I mean, they are to some extent, but at the same time, that isn't aligned with the interests of the country. And
I think this is why you need to depoliticize some of the major stuff, or at least legislate that it must be crossbench, you know, rather than, because energy strategy would be a phenomenal example of that, where it's just been short-term pandering or long-term without any implementation. no one has stood up and advocated for, right, I'm going to work hard to be a member of parliament for the next 25 years, and I'm going to see through this energy strategy until I can hand it over to someone else who's in a similar boat. And regardless of what party I'm in, right, I will obviously, the nature of the beast is you have to toe the party line, otherwise you lose the whip, right? But you would need a group of people, and those people do exist in parliament. It's just that at the top level, I think they get squashed. And the problem is, we've got, I don't think anyone would really argue, the most technically capable prime minister at the moment than we've had 40, 50 years, maybe more. But that, unfortunately, technical capability is not good enough on its own, right? You need all those others. Clinton was a phenomenally intelligent man, right? Incredibly intelligent, but he also was an incredible people person and had that leadership way about him, which Sunak just doesn't have, unfortunately. And that's where some of that is lacking. But you do need, let's face it, we haven't had a PM last 5 years for some time, have we? I can't remember what was the last PM that lasted 5 years. I suppose it was Cameron, wasn't it? And 5 years of that was coalition, and then 2 years was an utter mess as a majority Conservative leader. I agree. I think the trouble is it's easy in corporate because meritocracy, generally speaking, works. Obviously there are problems. There is nepotism. There is the old crony network. There are all those things that you do have to deal with. But generally speaking, meritocracy works. And generally speaking, you get activist shareholders who will get stuck into things and make things happen, right? Who are also, and they are ultimately incentivized by their pocketbooks. Whereas in politics, it's more a cause to do something bigger. You hope, because you don't want them to be incentivized by their pocketbooks. So if you get the big job like Boris, then you earn 3 million quid giving after dinner speeches or whatever. There is a bit of a, at the very top level, there is a runoff afterwards for sure. But it'll be a shame when Sunak gets beaten and goes back to doing what he does best, because we won't realise how much we missed him, nor how much he's done things for progressive taxation, for example, where he's lifted the personal allowance by a much bigger slice than anyone before. Done quite a lot on the very low paid. It's just that people don't necessarily feel he's done enough, and the inflation thing hasn't helped ultimately, because everybody's got hurt by that. And it was exactly why inflation has to be extinguished when it rears its head. But there we go.
Wow, it'll be interesting towards the next election. Let's see if the predictions from today is gonna. I'll put a date in the diary. 30th. Check in on the 30th of July predictions for interest rate, for elections, for how it happens 2 weeks after the election.
God damn it! I hate these predictions. God damn it.
I think it's good. Like the prediction itself isn't as important, and as I think the way you come up with the prediction, because that's the key thing. And as things change, obviously the predictions might change, but the way you come up with those things is super valuable, and it's easy to put it into different contexts and different things. So
there's a phenomenal book called Super Forecasting I think it's by a chap called Philip Tetler. Which I would encourage anybody listening to who's interested in that sort of thing to read or listen to on Audible or whatever, which talks about how often there's a small group of people who they deem to be super forecasters, and one of the very common things about them is they regularly update their forecasts. Right, it's the old. I think it was John Maynard Keynes, wasn't it? When the facts change, I change my mind, sir. What do you do? Sort of thing, where you can't hold to one prediction for the sake of holding to it, because there you go. Philip is that Tetlock? Is it Tetlock? Yeah, great book.
Yeah,
great book. Well worth reading or listening to. Bonus.
I'm getting it.
Good man. Good man.
Sunday sorted.
Excellent.
Nice. Okay, well, we reached 10 o'clock again. Fantastic chat. Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Helen, for for the chat, for sharing your opinions and views. And we'll be back next week, hopefully with Jay. I think we'll be back tonight, the full team. Yay. All right. Have an amazing Sunday, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.